Welcome again. As Mark said, my talk's on socialism, and I'm usually very enthusiastic about this talk, especially because I want to make sure that I overshadow the next speaker. But the next speaker is Peter Klein, so I feel like I can sleepwalk through this talk. I'll still be fine. Okay. I want to start by drawing your attention to what I think is the most important article in economics written in the 20th century. It's by Ludwig von Mises, and the name of it is Economic Calculation in a Socialist Commonwealth. It was brought back, it was published initially in 1920, and then it was republished as part of his 1922 book on socialism. And it is in print, and it has been for the last 20 years or so, by the Mises Institute, Economic Calculation of Socialist Commonwealths, and I highly recommend it. In particular, there's a very insightful article by a prominent contemporary Austrian. It's an epilogue to the book, so you might want to pay careful attention to that also. The initials are JTS. So. Okay. Why is this article so important? Okay, it's really important for three reasons. First of all, it did completely destroy the intellectual foundations of the case for central planning, socialist central planning. But it also represented a revolutionary breakthrough in economic theory, because I think Mises for the first time demonstrated the nature and necessity of the price system in allocating resources. We'll talk about the view of the price system prior to Mises in a moment. And finally, and this is a little bit more technical, but it completed Karl Menger's revolution in the sense that it finally showed how people's subjective values are translated into objective prices, okay, and how these cardinal prices are then used for monetary calculation. That is, to determine profits, calculate profits and losses, and to use as a guide to allocate resources to the most urgent consumer demands. So it shows how qualitative data, like people's values and so on, are translated into cardinal numbers that are useful for economic calculation. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Initially, there were a group of socialists in the early 19th century. They predated Karl Marx. They were known as the Utopian Socialists, and let me just give you some of their names. And all of them, they're the top three. Charles Fourier, French, Henri Saint-Simon, also French, and Robert Owen. And what they did was to each come up with their own view of the ideal society. Fourier was particularly crazy. He actually wrote that under socialism, roasted chickens would fly through the air into men's mouths. I mean, he said that. The oceans would turn into lemonade, and human beings would be able to ride lions. He also came up with a crazed plan to put everyone, or to house everyone in communities, one huge house that would hold about 15 to 1,600 people, based on the old Roman phalanx. Okay, where the Roman army would march with a certain amount of people sort of in a square. He actually drew pictures of what the ideal house was. Okay, so that was it. I mean, he designated certain rooms for common rooms, other rooms for sleeping quarters, the dining room and so on. He believed that sexual roles would completely disappear in this phalanstère, it was called in French, phalanstère. Though he didn't advocate free love like Henri Saint-Simon did. Okay, he still thought there was a place for the family. And I recently found that these were never built in France, where he wrote, but a few of his followers in the U.S. built them one county away from my house. Very, very inviting, right? You expect Lurch from the Addams Family to answer the door if you go trick-or-treating. Here's even a scarier picture of it. Put up higher so you can, yeah. So that's the Phalanstère, or I think in English it's phalanstery, something like that. Okay. All right. So all of this was incredibly embarrassing to the socialists. The classical economists, even though they hadn't developed a fully worked out theory of economic calculation, using supply and demand smashed these people intellectually and embarrassed them. Okay. But the classical economists basically, the problem that they pointed out was, who takes out the garbage? Under socialism, where everyone gets treated equally, where everyone has, equal shares, or at least shares of the output according to their needs, what incentive is there for someone to do the dirty, unhealthy jobs that people that have a stigma? Who's going to be the garbage man? Going to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning? Why should somebody do that rather than be the librarian? They prefer to be the librarian if everybody's getting equal amounts. So they pointed out that, how would you give people the incentive to do those, or who would go down the mine shaft into a deep mine and risk lung disease and cave-ins and so on, when they weren't getting paid any more than someone else who's doing a job, let's say farming or something. So that was the response of the classical economists. Now, the utopian socialists responded that there'll be a new socialist man that will emerge under these new social arrangements, living in the Phalanstère and so on. Drinking lemonade out of the ocean. And these people would not care about their own self-interest, but they would care about furthering the interests of society. Okay. But both sides assumed that was an incentive problem that had to be solved. How to get people to do certain things that you wanted them to do. They never asked the question, what things do we want them to do? What things do we want them to produce? They never asked that question, okay? Everyone assumed that if you could solve the incentive problem, then socialism would be just as productive as capitalism. Now, Marx was a brilliant strategist, okay? And what he did, and let me just go back to the second slide here, is to come up with an argument that anyone who talked about what the future social society would look like was unscientific, okay, because he was embarrassed by the utopian socialists. So he used this rhetorical ploy. What he said was that socialism was coming with the inevitability of the laws of nature. There were laws of history that would bring about, as the final stage of society, socialism, or actually that's the next to left. There'll be a sort of full communism as the final stage. And there was no need to speculate on it because it was happening no matter what human beings thought or did. Okay? Just as feudalism, or just as the classical slavery gave way to feudalism, okay, which was a higher stage of the economy, well then feudalism gave way to mercantile capitalism and then to industrial capitalism, which were progressively higher. Well, and all of these, according to Marx, all of these stages of history contain within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. So capitalism would result eventually, the profit mode would result in capital being accumulated, okay, concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer huge monopoly capitalists. And so there'd only be like 10 of them left in the world, and then the workers would far outnumber them and just take the stuff away. Okay? So capitalism created its own destruction. And then socialism would emerge naturally. So once again, his whole point was to get everyone to shut up about what socialism would look like. Because he knew that there was really no way to sort of formulate a socialist society. Okay? To come up with a reasonable plan for social society. And his great work wasn't on socialism. It was named what? Everyone knows the name. Das Kapital. It was on capitalism and the problems with capitalism. He didn't say anything about socialism and what it would look like. There were very fleeting passages where he talks about socialism. But he had no plan for socialism. And his whole point was that anyone who tried to set out a plan for socialism was unscientific. Thus, he called his brand of socialism scientific socialism. And he was the one who named the other socialists, the earlier socialists, utopian socialists. And he hated them more than he hated, the capitalists. Okay, he was continually attacking those people. Okay. So now let's look at what Mises' argument was. It's actually pretty straightforward. And there were some earlier economists that got glimpses of what Mises' argument was. But it was really Mises who put the whole thing together. So here's what Mises basically said. First of all, he defined socialism as that system under which all of the material means of production, the non-human means of production, are owned by one agency, the central planning agency or the state or the socialist state. Okay? All means of production are collectively owned. Okay? There can be private property in your own clothing, even in your own houses and gardens and so on, but all the things that were used in production outside of labor were owned collectively, owned by the state. Okay? And therefore, the state had to make the decisions about how to allocate resources, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, how many of the various different kinds of goods to produce, and so on. So, starting from that point, and by the way, there's a book by a German economist. It was written in the mid-19th century. His name was Albert Scheffler. And the book was called A Quintessence of Socialism. And he went through all the different socialist plans up to that point. And the one feature that he found in common was that they all wanted to abolish private property. So Mises was right in taking that as the hallmark of socialism. It's the abolition of private property in the means of production. Okay. So here's Mises' argument. His thesis was the rational allocation of resources is impossible without economic calculation, okay, calculating profits and losses, using actual market prices. That's his thesis. Now he argued, number one, socialism abolishes private property and capital goods and natural resources. They're all owned by the state. But if one group owns all of the resources, well then, the next thing follows. If the socialist state is the sole owner of the material factors of production, they can no longer be exchanged. There are no markets for them. There's one owner. There's a monopoly owner. But if there's only one owner, and there's no exchange, then there can never be any prices. And without prices, the socialist state can never figure out what the cost of production is. Even if they pay the workers with money, and the workers buy the consumer's goods with money, and the consumer's goods have prices, the steel, the iron, the agricultural produce, the raw materials, and so on. None of those things have prices. Okay? Which means you can't compare prices and costs. Socialism will never know the costs. They'll never know whether they're giving up something of greater value when they produce an extra automobile. Should they use those materials to produce 5 more bicycles or 2 more motorcycles, or use the steel in building let's say a silo to hold grain? They don't know how to determine the best and most valued uses of all the resources that they own. So socialism is doomed to be chaos. A socialist economy literally is impossible in the sense that economy means economizing resources, using them only, because resources are scarce, using them only for the most valuable uses and renouncing those uses that are much less valuable. Okay? So socialism could never determine what's the most valuable use of steel, what's the most valuable use of all the gasoline we're producing, the various parts of it, and so on. Okay, let me give you sort of an example. Well, let me point out one thing. So Mises points out that socialism then, because of the collective ownership of the means of production, abolishes the preconditions of economic calculation. You need private property in all stages of goods, not just consumer goods, but including capital goods. So everything can be exchanged between private owners and therefore have prices. You need freedom to exchange all kinds of goods and services. If, as in maybe in 18th century England, where there was where land couldn't be sold, it had to be passed down to the oldest son. It's not enough. So there was private property, but you didn't have the freedom to exchange certain things, land in this case, and so it would lead to an inefficient use of land. You also need the freedom to exchange all kinds of goods and services. But there are no markets under socialism for capital goods and for the services of land and so on. And finally, you need a sound money, a money whose value is independent of political influence. Okay? And under socialism, you don't have that. Okay? You really don't have a money. Even if they pay workers, that's just a voucher to buy consumer goods. It's not a full money against which all things can be exchanged. Everything in the whole structure of production, from land to all the different types of capital goods and raw materials and so on. Okay? So there is no general medium of exchange or money under socialism. So socialism destroys all three preconditions and therefore abolishes economic calculation. Now, what does this mean? Let me give you an example. Let's say the socialist planner is deciding to ignore the handwritten stuff on the right side. Now, the socialist planner certainly knows how to produce various things. He has teams of scientists and engineers that he can consult, and they have all the latest technical knowledge. Mises assumed that. Mises also assumed something that's probably not true, or that definitely is not true, that the socialist planner knows all the different types of resources that he has at his disposal. Okay, he knows, every ton of steel and exactly where they're located. Okay, and exactly the strength of each type of steel, and as well as everything else in the economy. So he has full knowledge of all these things. Well, here's his problem. So he knows the production function, those things that he needs to use to produce an automobile. And he needs, or you could think of it as to produce a new batch of automobiles, 10,000 new automobiles. Should he produce those 10,000 new automobiles or all the other things that he could produce with steel, machine time, labor, unskilled labor, engineering labor, the factory space, and so on. But he knows that if he uses P tons of steel plus Q hours of machine time plus R hours of unskilled labor plus a certain amount of engineering labor and a certain square feet of factory space, kilowatts of electricity, and so on, he'll come out with one automobile, okay? Or it could be 10,000 if you want, whatever. Okay, well, that's fine. Okay, should he produce that automobile? What's the cost of producing that automobile? Even if consumers are willing to pay 100,000 rubles for it, if it's in the Soviet Union. Can you add up tons of steel, hours of machine time, square feet of factory space, kilowatts of electricity, and get one unitary figure? Can you get one cardinal number? Of course not. He never knows his costs. So, socialist production is chaotic. He doesn't know if, by producing these 10,000 new automobiles, he's using all those different resources, which could be used in almost an infinite number of other ways, in other production processes throughout the economy. He doesn't know whether what the most valuable use of those resources are. Okay, whether the next most valuable use of those resources is higher than the value of those 10,000 new cars. Okay, so he's always doomed to producing the wrong thing. He's like a man in the middle of a desert with no compass. Okay, where everything looks the same. Okay, there's only one direction to go to save yourself, to get water, and there's literally almost an infinite number of directions to go if you slightly vary in the directions. Okay, and so he'll never ever be able to rationally allocate resources. Let me give you an example from the real world. I have a friend, a childhood friend who I grew up with, who eventually married a cowboy, actually a real-life cowboy, from Montana. And so she moved to Montana, and it's a big ranch, and they have cattle and so on, and there's some oil they found oil on their land. So one day about 15 years ago, she called me and she says, we got a new house. And I said, great. I said, did you move? She says, no. She says, we had it shipped in. So I'm from New Jersey, where everybody just builds the houses, on site. So I said, what do you mean it was shipped in? She says, well, out here, the houses are built in modular sections in Nebraska, in a huge factory, and then they're put on those double-wide trucks, and the pieces are sent to the site, and then they're assembled. Now, why would that be? Well, because there's about 10 people in Montana, and the cost of construction labor is extremely high, okay? And in fact, why? Because ranching and other sorts of activities, farming and so on, have a much higher value for labor in Montana than does building homes. So what was done is that instead of using a labor-intensive process, instead of using a lot of laborers and bring them to the spot where you're building the house, you use few laborers in a huge factory that's mechanized to build the house. It's actually cheaper that way. Okay? Now, could the socialist planner ever come up with that idea that, you know what, it pays to build a house 1,000 miles away, or I don't know my geography out there, I don't know how far Nebraska is from there, 1,000 miles away or 800 miles away, and then ship the house, a huge 5-bedroom house, to Montana? Okay? Without prices, you could never know this. There'd be no way to know this. And in fact, now you can look at the Q plus A. I mean, what you could do is produce automobiles like we did at the turn of the century. At the turn of the century, we used a lot of labor. This was before mass production was introduced by Henry Ford in 1910 or so. A little bit later than that, actually. But in any case, there were a lot of laborers. All the parts were made in a small blacksmith shop or a small bicycle factory. And, you know, they produce about 6 cars a month or something like that, with all the laborers each specializing in a certain piece and then putting them all together. Okay? So there's many different ways to produce automobiles, right? From a completely robotic factory run by one guy who pushes a button on a computer that starts the process in the morning, okay? So having a lot of capital and little labor, to the old turn of the century way of producing cars with a lot of labor and very little machinery and so on, or the intermediate ways that we have today, okay? Though it's increasingly becoming more mechanized and there are fewer and fewer workers. If you look at, it's a plant, the Kia plant that's about 10, 15 miles from here, Don? Yeah. And it's huge. The plant is huge, and there's very few cars in the parking lot because the labor force is so small, because labor productivity is so high because of all the machinery there, okay? Now, why do we have all those machines and so few laborers? Because it's cheaper to build cars that way, okay? At least in this situation. So, to draw your attention to the bottom, does that mean capitalism is perfect in producing automobiles? No, we know it's not perfect, but they can calculate. So in other words, if there's an entrepreneur who believes that he can get $21,000 for a particular model car, by building 10,000 of these models, of this model, and he can easily find out if it's worth doing from his own point of view and from the point of view of consumers as a whole. If he can get all of those resources, and remember, in a market economy, all resources are traded for money. So at any moment in time, all resources have prices. So no matter what sort of production process you want to undertake, you will always know what? Your cost of production. You'll simply add up the prices of the resources that you're using as inputs. Okay? And then if this is 18,000, you compare it to the 21,000, then you've taken resources that would have been used to produce goods that are only worth $18,000, and you're using them to produce goods that are worth $21,000. You are moving resources from lower valued uses to higher valued uses, and you're rewarded by profits. On the other hand, if, in the case of SUVs and the higher price of automobiles, a higher price of gasoline that has occurred in the last few years, the cost of production may have been $32,000, and the price of those SUVs that consumers are willing to pay was $28,000, then you've lost money. Capitalist entrepreneurs can lose money. They do it all the time. The point is, they know they're making a mistake. They don't persist in making that mistake. Resources shift out of those areas where money is being lost, okay? And they shift into areas where money is being, where profits are being earned. So that's why we had a movement away from larger automobiles of late to smaller automobiles, okay, to serve on gas. And you can look at many different cases, okay? So the socialist planner is in a different situation, okay? Both are uncertain about the future, but the capitalist can estimate future consumer prices. He can make informed guesses because he knows what consumer prices were in the past, and he has ideas about how their demands will change in the future, and so he uses that past experience to estimate, we call it appraisement, to appraise a future price. Okay? Then he compares it to the actual cost of producing the good. If the costs are less, then he produces the good. If it's greater, then he decides not to produce the good. Okay? Right. And so that's why socialism is really doomed to chaotic production and to eventually collapse. Okay. Let me just say one other thing here, because some people have criticized Mises for this. Did Mises say that there could be no socialist economy under any circumstances? No, he was just talking about a situation in which you had a modern, developed economy, where you had developed technology, where resources could be used to produce almost anything. Okay, pretty much today, anything can be turned into anything if you're willing to pay the cost. Okay, so basically, given all the resources we have in the U.S., there's really an infinite number of production processes that you could undertake. But your resources are limited, so you have to choose those production processes which are most valuable from the point of view of consumers. And that's why you need prices, not only of consumer goods, but of producer goods. Now, let me give you a simple example of where you could sort of make the correct decision in allocating resources. And this also is an example of what illustrates why socialism can't. This is Robinson Crusoe, okay, and he has, let's say, 12 hours to work, and then he gets exhausted, so he has to sleep. So every day he has to allocate his resources. And now, in Robinson Crusoe's economy, there are very few scarce producers' goods. Basically, his labor is scarce, okay? So let's say that he decides to allocate his labor in 3-hour increments. So he takes 3-hour units. So he says, well, what most important to me is the 2 fish I could get from fishing for 3 hours. Second most important to me is, picking wild mushrooms. Okay, I get 3 pounds of them. I could make mushrooms with the fish and so on. And I could get 8 coconuts, so I can have the coconut milk and so on. And that's the third best use of my 3 hours of labor. And I can also use 3 hours to pick a sack of berries so I can have dessert or something. Okay. All right, so that would then use up his labor time. Now the question becomes, he suddenly realizes that there are rabbits on the island so that he could add meat to his diet. Okay. Or that he could use an axe. He could create an axe if he sees there's materials to make an axe. And so that would be easy for him to get the mushrooms or any other things that are in trees because he can cut them down, or even to build a house. So the point is, now, he says to himself, there are new opportunities. Should I use 3 hours to produce a rabbit? Or should I use 3 hours a day to produce an axe? Okay. He can easily answer that question because he can right away see that there's only one really scarce resource, that's his labor. What's the cost of producing the rabbit? The lowest valued use of his 3 hours. It's the sack of berries. If the rabbit has a higher value to him than the sack of berries, then he'll produce it. Because in this case, now, it's not money profit, it's psychic profit. In this case, the benefit he expects to get from the rabbit exceeds the benefit he expects to get from eating the berries. So the benefit we call the psychic revenue, that's the satisfaction you get, and the cost we call the psychic cost, okay? That's what you have to give up. That's the satisfaction you give up. If your benefit is greater than your cost, then you earn a psychic profit. You've given up something less valuable, the berries that you could have gotten for 3 hours, for something more valuable, okay? So the point is, when you have a complex economy with a very developed capital structure and highly advanced technology, you need prices. You can't directly value things. So this is called direct valuation. Under a complex economy with a huge capital structure, you need calculation, not valuation. Okay, there are so many resources out there that the central planning agency cannot arrange them in valuations because there's an infinite number of things they can be used to produce. Okay, there's an infinite number of ways that you can combine all the resources here in the U.S. if you were a Soviet commissar, okay, that controlled the U.S. economy. Okay, so can Robinson Crusoe approximately maximize his utility or produce things that satisfy his most highly valued wants? Yes, he can. But that's not that's not what is going on in an economy where there are many scarce resources with many different uses. Okay. So what did Mises say about socialism? He said, the essence of socialism isn't that the socialist planner lacks knowledge. He may know all about all the different resources. He may have teams of scientists and engineers giving him all of the latest theories that apply to production. It's not a lack of knowledge. Mises says the essential mark of socialism is that one will alone acts. It is immaterial whose will it is. Could be a benevolent, it could be a saint, it could be Mother Teresa, or it could be an evil guy like Stalin. Doesn't matter. The main thing is that the employment of all factors of production is directed by one agency only. One will alone chooses, decides, directs, acts, gives orders. The distinctive mark of socialism is the oneness and indivisibility of the will directing all production activities within the whole social system. What does that mean? What is he getting at? If you have one will that controls all of those things, there cannot be what? Exchange, prices, markets, and economic calculation. You can never know whether you're producing the right things or not. Okay? So let me just sum up some of the conclusions or implications of what Mises' argument. First, he means it when he says that the socialist economy is impossible. It's literally impossible. It's impossible in the sense, and we'll get to some of the criticisms of this, but it's impossible in the sense that the socialist planner can never know if he's rationally allocating resources. And rational allocation means choosing to produce something that is more valuable rather than less valuable. Okay, he cannot do that. Okay. In fact, as Mises says, socialist planning is an oxymoron. Okay, and he uses the word planned chaos. It's planned chaos. Only when individual entrepreneurs plan do you have an orderly, rational system. Because even though they're decentralized, they can all plan using the same price system. So all their plans are coordinated. Okay? Let me just give you an example of Soviet planning. There was a famine in the Soviet Union, the USSR, and the Soviet Union has some of the best farmland or had some of the best farmland in the world. I mean, they had the Ukraine, which is the breadbasket of Europe, and so on. And yet there was famine. Well, what you found was that there were a lot of tractors, but they were rusting in the field because there wasn't enough gasoline produced. And you had all these silos that were built, but they didn't have wheat in them. But there was wheat. The wheat was there, and it was rotting because there was no gasoline to run the tractors, which were rusting, to harvest the grain. Okay, you didn't have enough workers and so on because they were producing the steel that would have produced more tractors, which you don't need because they're not running anyway. Okay, so the whole point is that it's a machine that just turns mindlessly and produces garbage, basically. So all those figures that economists talked about, how by 2000, Paul Samuelson, the famous neoclassical economist, wrote as late as maybe 1988 or 1987 edition of his famous book, Principles of Economics. He said that by this past decade, the Soviet Union would have converged in their rate of growth to the U.S. Okay, he's using statistics that were compiled by the CIA. Okay, who's always wrong about everything. Okay. Right? They didn't see 9/11 coming. They completely overestimated the Soviets' military capability, their economic strength. Okay, so instead of almost being being equal with us, their economy is about 20% of what ours is. Okay, but Austrians had said that all along. Austrians had said the Soviet Union is going to collapse of its own weight. Okay. Now, how did the Soviet Union actually operate? They operated according to something called gross output planning. They tried to have a coordinated plan, and the agency, the economic planning agency, was called Gosplan. Okay. Now, gross output planning meant that you would assign each industry a certain amount of output. Okay. And then within the industries, there were different firms, so the plant managers would be assigned, different amounts of that quota to meet. And so, for example, if you're producing nails, they would, let's say they specified your target in tons. Now, if you met your target, or if you exceeded your target, you got a vacation on the Black Sea, okay? But if you fell short of your target, you got a free trip to the Gulag, okay? So they had incentives in place to get them to do stuff. Now, of course, it was a system of mutual lying, right? You want them to set your target as low as possible, okay? So you tell them, well, you lie to them and you tell them that we can't produce more than X amount. And they know you're lying, so they say, well, you have to produce Y amount. Well, you know that they're going to make you produce more than your target, than you tell them, so you lower it even more. So it's a system of mutual lying about things, okay? So let's say they set your target in tons of nails. Well, it turns out that in the 1980s, there were a lot of buildings that were built, a lot of structures, including houses, that had no roofs, okay? Why didn't they have any roofs? Because roofing nails are very small, okay? And if you specify the output in terms of tons of nails, then it's in their interest, because it's easier to produce big nails than it is to produce a lot of small nails. It's cheaper, okay, in terms of using resources. It's easier to meet your target. So they produced all big nails. And there was a shortage of small nails, okay? The same thing was true of women's clothing. They were all in large and extra large sizes. So they look like they're walking around in these huge, bags. And that's why American jeans were selling for hundreds of dollars on Soviet black markets there at the end, okay? Because people wanted some sort of style, okay? So there were no children's shoes, or they were all large shoes because they were specified in terms of amounts of leather that you use to produce shoes and so on. So there was a cartoon in Pravda that looked like this. Okay, this is a train. That's a nail. The guy with the big hats, the commissar, those big furry hats at the bottom, and then that's the plant manager saying, well, comrade, I met my output plan for nails this year. Okay, obviously, he met it in terms of tons, right? It was huge, okay? Also, in a speech in 1956, or I think it was 56, 57, Khrushchev started all of a sudden berating the lamp producers, the chandelier producers, because it turns out that some of the comrades had been killed and injured by chandeliers just pulling down whole ceilings and crashing onto people and tables. Why? Because it was specified in the number of pounds of chandeliers you turned out. Okay, so they're building really heavy chandeliers that were pulling down ceilings. I mean, you'd laugh, but I mean, this stuff went on regularly. Okay, because there's no prices. Okay, obviously. Why do we have small nails being produced today, even though they're more costly to produce per unit weight? Because if they're in short supply, the prices jump up above their cost of production. People shift resources into it. In other words, you can calculate. Okay. A few other things I want to mention. Okay. Now, one of the criticisms of Mises' argument was, he's got to be wrong because the Soviet Union lasted for, 80 years, whatever it was, okay? How could that be? Okay, if Mises was right, how could the Soviet Union last for all that time? Okay? Granted, it may not have been super efficient, but the economy ran. There's a socialist economy. Well, Mises met that argument in advance in 1920. And what he said was that the Soviet Union is not a true socialist country because it's set in a world where there are capitalist prices. And he compared it to the post office. He says the reason why the post office is totally inefficient, though we know they're very, very inefficient, right, is because there are prices that it can at least look at to allocate resources. Okay? Even though they don't have an incentive because they don't earn profits, they can at least adopt the new technology or the lower cost technology as it comes about and so on. Right? So Mises says that Soviet Union was like an island of chaos in the middle of a sea of capitalist prices. So the capitalist prices influenced their ideas about how to use resources. Now, they weren't prices of their particular inputs, which had different scarcity values, but they could at least use those prices. And indeed they did. In fact, in the 50s, China was sending away for Sears catalogs to figure out how to price certain things.